Good evening, everyone. My name's Anne Dobbing, and I'm a member of the Scottish Laity Network. And tonight it's my great privilege to welcome you to the second evening of our Advent journey for 2021. As you know, the overall theme for our Advent journey is Mary of Nazareth, companion in our journey. This was the name that the 6th Interchurch Gathering of Base Communities in Brazil in 1986 gave to Mary, and the name was rooted in their faith and their practice.
In Latin America, where the poor are every day becoming more aware of their situation of oppression and motivated by their deep faith, are uniting in solidarity and becoming organised in pursuit of liberation. Mary is not only their travelling companion, but also the voice of their yearning and hope.
During our Advent journey, we're called to reflect on the signs of the times and the yearnings and hopes of people today. And so we begin our evening prayer.
Mary, companion of Indigenous people, we pray for a renewed appreciation of the culture and gift of all Indigenous people.
Mary, companion of refugees, we pray that we may always see and respond to refugees as our sisters and brothers.
Mary, young Palestinian woman, we pray for peace and justice in Palestine, especially in the occupied lands.
Mary, Mother of Jesus, we pray for all children who suffer because of war, violence, hunger, failed political and economic systems. Let us act for them.
And now, let us spend a minute in silent prayer with our own intentions. I am honoured tonight to be introducing Caoimhe. Caoimhe was brought up in a liberation theology background, and this deeply inspired her to engage in human rights work, standing up against injustices. This inspiration manifested itself in many ways and in many places, such as living in her teens in New York Catholic worker community, and working with people with AIDS in Zimbabwe. She spent 3 years with Mayan Indians in Guatemala and Chiapas, Mexico.
She lived for a year in the Jenin Gaza refugee camp and has also been part of a group of peace workers in Palestine who acted as human shields to protect children, women and men from Israeli guns. She was shot while trying to lead Palestinian children to safety. She was named the Time magazine as one of the European of the Year in 2003, and in 2016 won the Irish Council for Civil Liberties Human Rights Film Award for her coverage of the refugee crisis. It is a privilege to welcome Caoimhe as our companion this evening. Thank you, Caoimhe.
Thank you, Gemma. And it's lovely to see such a diverse gathering. I'm reading all of the geographies of the participants, and from Zimbabwe and India and all over, Dublin, Shropshire, yay, Scotland. It's very lovely to be in your presence. And just to clarify, the biography that I sent to Frank was just 2 lines long, so that was an extended version of it. But thank you, Gemma, for your kind words. Yeah, I think that's the thing about getting older. It's one likes to sort of move on from the more sensationalist aspects of one's past, but it's a real pleasure to be amongst you. I felt that when Anne was leading some of the prayers and intentions, just of a reminder of, in some ways, in the intense busyness of some of the work that I'm sort of going to, I think, touch upon in broad brushstrokes tonight. But that lack of sort of space for pause and the contemplative around it. And as you were articulating those beautiful intentions, which I actually found quite poignant because they were so simple and so powerful at the same time. You know, were we to live in a world in which empathy was embodied? You know, were we to live in a world in which social justice, you know, is a continuum, in which human rights are accessible to all, in which the extractive relationship, you know, that we assume with natural resources and with human beings and communities and their labor, could that be challenged? You know, could systems that nurture, that care, you know, that grow that enormous potential in those children that were referred to, you know, oftentimes on the receiving end of whether that is state violence, political violence, economic violence, the violence of poverty, and enforced dependency, the subtle humiliations of that, you know, for people who have so much courage and tenacity and creativity. But while those words were being spoken, they actually brought me back to a church that has been sort of on my mind recently. Sorry, I overestimated the cold, but in Lampedusa. And it's because just before I came on, I sort of saw, you know, that the papal visit to Malta and Lesbos that will be happening over the next couple of weeks. And I was in Lampedusa island off the coast of Italy in the Mediterranean Sea a few years ago during a standoff in which there were over 200 women, men and children who were fleeing Libya, the systematic human rights violations that many people are subjected to in Libya as they transit or attempt to transit through there in search of lives of more safety and dignity and meaning and choice. But while that standoff was going on, we were trying to support our friends and colleagues who were on the ship with those who were making the journey. And there is a church in Lampedusa in which the cross is made of oars. And there's so much symbolism in that church, you know, in a place, unfortunately, on an island in which there has been the same sort of swing to the right as has been witnessed in many other parts of Europe, but that it was a place of welcome and refuge, in which people who had disembarked rescue ships and were in a period of limbo waiting to transit further on in their journeys could come and receive hospitality, and even basic things like the Wi-Fi was left open so that people could make their calls on WhatsApp to family members back home to assure them that they had survived. But in that place of pause, I remember thinking similarly those few years ago, the importance of pause, the importance of punctuation in this work, of moments of intentional community, of reflection, of sustenance, really for us all. And because those words that were mentioned in the intentions, as well as the empathy and solidarity, vis-a-vis injustice and inequality and oppression, it's violent. It lands violently on the bodies of whether those Indigenous communities that were mentioned or those in the global South on the receiving end of our patterns of consumption and extraction. It lands violently on the bodies of those, dying of hypothermia or drowning in the Channel, in the Central Mediterranean, in the Aegean Sea. It lands violently on the bodies of children in forests between Poland and Belarus, and navigating the Balkans. And part of my work recently actually has been around how do we resource the responders? How do we recognize that we all have finite potentials or finite sort of capacities for carrying suffering and carrying pain, I think psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, physiologically, and how do we respond to, in a way, the humility of our bodies, our central nervous systems, or our not autonomic nervous systems, how do we respond to, that both vicarious or secondary trauma, but also vicarious and secondary resilience from the communities that we work with? How do we hold those spaces of joy and potentiality and light amidst a lot of suffering? So I don't have answers to any of that, but it is something that I think about frequently, that I work around these days. And I was thinking about that a lot last night on a personal level. And I'm just going to tell this one little vignette of a beautiful Syrian family, just as illustration, although I'm sure a lot of you on here, if you're on here, are already engaged in this work in one way or another with local communities or families or friends or broader community as well. Which I'm sure is what brings you to these spaces of nurture. But I thought, just as a way of illustrating, I might tell a few vignettes actually over the course of the next 20 minutes. But also, Callum, keep me to my time, give me signals when I'm near it, or Anne, or whomever feels moved to. But this family are from near Idlib in Syria, and I met them in Lesbos refugee camp, which is, most of you I'm sure know, but one of the Greek islands that people making the journey from Turkey, having transited through Turkey oftentimes from Afghanistan or Iran or Syria or Iraq, sometimes from Eritrea and Congo and the Central African Republic, Sudan, a whole multiplicity of contexts and geographic origins. But as they transit through the islands, sort of pre what was known as the EU-Turkey deal, which I'm sure you're familiar with, in 2016, that period of transition was brief. And so the nature of the work of those who responded in solidarity there, whether it was cooking hot food or engaged in a search and rescue capacity on dinghies that would go out into Greek and Turkish territorial waters, those who were there as volunteer medics on the shores as people would come off the dinghies, oftentimes very wet and very cold, sometimes in shock, sometimes in acute distress, sometimes carrying a lot of joy and relief and happiness. But in the context of those islands, that work and that witness was one of accompanying people for perhaps a few days, perhaps a few weeks as they transited further north and west. Since 2016, the work on the islands has been more one of responding to a context of containment, enforced containment in camps, whether they're open or closed, and deliberate policies of deterrent that unfortunately are being implemented by the EU and actualized in an increasingly rights-denying way in Greece and the Balkans and other contexts. So these days, those who witness, those who do the work, I think around a lot of what tonight is centered in terms of, and I'm thinking here from my own sort of formative years as a teenager, but the works of mercy that are described so beautifully in the Catholic worker ethos in terms of sisterhood and brotherhood and community. And visiting prisoners and burying the dead with dignity, and being in communion, breaking bread with our brothers and sisters who don't have homes, who are sleeping rough in the cold. But in that response to people who are kept in states of enforced precarity in the camps, one meets people from so many different contexts, so many different stories, so many different spectrums of suffering and of tenacity and courage and hospitality. So this particular family I met when I was pre a fire which burned down a camp called Moria that you might be familiar with a couple of years ago. I was in a part of the camp that's known as the Olive Grove, and it was sort of the overspill from a camp that was designed for under 2,000 people, and even then the conditions were bad, and by the time the fire hit it, over 23,000 women, men and children were living in a space in which there was very little humanitarian infrastructure, in which there was a real denial of rights, in which the psychological and I'd say existential, spiritual impacts of the humiliations, the violence of the camp, both vis-a-vis sort of the state and also internally, was so acute that children as young as 7 were self-harming. MSF was seeing suicide attempts by children as young as 11. So there was a lot of despair in the camp. So it took a lot of intentionality from families to get up every day and to decide to live and to nurture each other, to stand in solidarity with their tent mates, people, on either side of them, people in broader communities. And one of the families that I met while wandering up through this olive grove, which was this very densely inhabited sort of spillover of the camp into an olive grove, was a family from near Idlib. And they had been olive tree growers in Syria pre the war. They had olive groves. They used to produce olive oil. They also carved olive wood. And they were a family of farmers. And they used to say with pride that Imawad or Hadija, who was the sort of the matriarch of the family, but that she could drive a tractor as good as any man. And this was her sort of badge of pride, that she drove her tractor better than her sons did. But they were a family that had experienced a lot of loss. Their daughter-in-law had been killed by an airstrike. And her father, she was 6 years old at the time, Zaina. Her father, who was still alive, was in Germany. But because he was very new into the system, he wasn't allowed to apply for family reunification to bring her over through safer means yet. So they waited and they waited, and the situation in Idlib escalated. And they decided to cross the border to Turkey, and then eventually they made the journey to Greece. And when I met them in their shelter that they'd constructed from pallets and tarpaulin and plastic bags, plastic bin liners, big black ones, they had tried to make it as beautiful as possible for Zaina and for the children who accompanied them. They had a very intuitive, I felt, understanding of trauma and of interventions with children in terms of really just trying to build those spaces of joy and expression through play as well, even though none of them had formally read into that. But it felt like the buffer against sort of the more acute maybe manifestations of trauma or distress that one could imagine a child who had suffered so much already might exhibit, were held with a lot of care and compassion. And I remember I chatted to one of the women from the family outside their shelter. I was actually looking for somebody else, another Syrian family that I knew from the last time I had been there. And I speak Arabic, which helps, I think, warm that space of trust and communication. And they invited us in. I had brought along a photojournalist friend who was documenting in an ethical, I think, mindful way people's lives. And so we went into the shelter and we got chatting to them. And they spoke of their journey. And I was introduced to Abu Awad, who was the father of Awad, who was the eldest son, Khalid, who was this beautiful, beautiful man. And he, at that stage, was probably in his late 60s. He had Rimrod straight sort of posture. He was about 6 foot, this big handlebar mustache. And he was a farmer. He was from a rural context in Syria. Was very, very dignified, very welcoming, very warm, very compassionate. And I spent the following few weeks, whenever I'd go to the camp, I'd always drop in with them, spend time with them. We'd bring food and we'd cook together. We brought the kids to try and resource them with the limited supports that they could access in the camp, to try and find them lawyers, get them access to sort of the medical care that the grandmother Hadija needed. And meanwhile, throughout this, Abu Awad oftentimes would sort of look out at the camp, in which you could see children warming themselves around burning plastic, because it was the only fuel that was accessible other than pallets, which you had to buy. They were expensive. So plastic was sort of the currency in terms of fuel to keep children warm, to keep everybody warm. And when it would rain, it was the only way in which people could try and dry their blankets, dry their clothes. So children were breathing in, these toxic sort of smoke and fumes, and getting upper respiratory infections and, eye infections. And but he'd look at the camp and look at kids, sort of running around in the flip-flops of their parents in the mud, oftentimes because their shoes, were wet, and oftentimes, would be reserved for when they had to walk larger distances. And he used to say that his heart was sore seeing all of this suffering. And for the months that followed, for the actually 2 years that followed of them living in the camp, the only way they could try and get out of the camp was to emphasize the fact that Hadija, his wife, the grandmother of Zaina, had diabetes and herniated discs, and that Zaina exhibited signs of probably traumatic distress at one point or another in terms of sleep disturbance and just I think acting out some of her fear. So they focused on Hadija, the grandmother, and they all went years without any medical intervention screenings, and they made that journey. Got stuck in Athens, traversed through the Balkans. And then 2 months ago, I got a video of them running down the street in Germany with their arms outstretched, reuniting with their family who was there, with the father of Zaina, with their other son, with his family. And there was such joy. And I got this text from their adult son with a picture of them on the couch with their arms around each other, Hadija and Abu Awad, saying, "The youngsters have arrived in Germany." So it was positive and it was beautiful. And then I was back in Lesbos 2 weeks ago for about a month in total to attend the trial of 24 of our colleagues and friends who are up on trial for a Kafkaesque list of accusations, amongst them trafficking, treason, espionage, money laundering, forgery, etc. There's a very long list. Most of them search and rescue personnel, medics with MSF, volunteers, retired teachers, a lawyer. So we went there for their trial. And I was sitting with another family in the camp who had known this family very well. And we called them, and I hadn't spoken to them since I got those videos in Germany, other than just a few voice messages saying that I hope they were well, and that post-COVID, I really wanted to come and visit them. And I got a voice message from Hadija saying, we're worried about Abu Awad because his doctor said that he's got an infection in his heart. And then 2 days later, which was last week when I got back, 2 days later, after that, I got another voice message from Hadija saying, we're in shock. He has cancer of the heart. And between them being notified, between that diagnosis and his death last night, 8 days passed. He slipped into a coma 2 nights ago. And when I think of Abu Awad and think in a way of the metaphor that he was using for the suffering that he was witnessing, that his heart was sore, and the fact that could have been his heart was actually paining him, but that he stayed alive, long enough to get his family to safety. He stayed alive, long enough to protect his 7-year-old grandchild and get her back, to her father, get her back into a situation where maybe she'll have a future. I was really struck by, the slogans that borders are killing people. And I thought in a way, perhaps he had a genetic predisposition, perhaps he would have gotten sick anyways, but it would have been noted, it would have been noticed, his pain would have been taken seriously. And the incredible, I think, poignancy in a way of thinking of an elder, who, and I'm conscious, I'm not saying, sorry, late 60s, spring chickens, all of you on here. But I just thought, and a middle-ager myself, but I just thought at an age in which, maybe he could just pause a little bit, be with his grandchildren, have some of the reciprocal care that he gave to his children for so many years, reflected back to him, pursue other interests. He used to carve beautiful little carvings in the shelter, from the olive wood around them in their place of exile. But it really struck me in a way, that what we saw last week, with the deaths of, people with futures, with dreams, with hopes, with pasts, with resiliences, with contradictions, with the beautiful and flawed humanity that we all carry. To see those deaths in the Channel, to see the deaths, of children in a forest, freezing oftentimes, dying of the cold in a forest on the border of Belarus and Poland. It just really brought it home for me. In a way, the gravitas of these times, the urgency of these times, and the historical sort of juncture of these times of, in a continent that has known various different iterations, of fascism, of genocide, the Holocaust, of so much suffering and so many pledges of never again, that its scale is different, obviously. It's very different in terms of numbers, and yet the hardening of a rhetoric that is one of exclusion, of othering, of rejection, that is shrill oftentimes, that is cold. I watched the blocking of the RNLI boat, I think, that was trying to get out of a small town in Britain a few days ago, and just thought, in a way, what have we come to? That life-saving work is being blocked bodily, physically, by people who I think are consumed, with a rhetoric sometimes of fear, and sometimes of overt discrimination and racism. Yeah. But I suppose in to go back to the lovely calls at the beginning of this session, in a way it can seem complex. The numbers, the scale, of forced displacement, the catalyzing sort of factors of wars, of conflicts, of sectarian, conflict, of discrimination, of political oppression, exile, climate change, resource extraction, gender inequality. There's so many determinants, that will escalate. But in these times, that invitation, to inhabit a place of compassion, to do that in our local communities, in our broader communities, and to really bear witness, I think in a way, if we think of it in a context of which today is based upon, but of, of a path of a woman, of a path, of a family, of a broader community of, disciples, women and men who, or followers, who followed a message that in some ways was dramatically different, to a status quo. And in my own limited experience, I'm definitely not a theologian by any means, but in my periphery experience in the Catholic worker, amongst liberation theology orientated sort of communities in Latin and South America, amongst communities across Europe who are doing the work, there is such power, I think, in the concept of the works of mercy and the works of solidarity. And also what that calls out in ourselves. And for all of the suffering and for all of the pain and injustice and rights violations that are going on, there is something so powerful and freeing and beautiful about being in presence and in community around this work in these times. So I suppose I think I'm up to my time, but I might just sort of leave just an invitation, I think, for those who I'm sure you're all involved in many different ways, in one iteration or another of solidarity work, of care work, of community. But for those who can, in these times, I can think of few communities as needing of solidarity at the moment, as refuge seekers, of those facing, the multiple adversities and challenges of the journey, vis-a-vis militarized borders, of the internal process, of identity reformation, of exile, of displacement, of trying to rebuild lives, of safety, of meaning, and the dreams that people carry along that path. And I would say, just to sort of in a way watch this space, because I have such assurance in my own mind and heart that those who have made this journey over the past 7, 8, years, over the decades before that how they will story their own stories in the years to come, young people through, and older people, through art, through music, through poetry, through writing, how they restory what they've lived will be really interesting and instructive. And I think in a way will shift the narrative too of maybe sort of helpers and helped into, the profound and deep learning that we really need to sit with in terms of that wisdom that is carried by people making the journey. So thank you very much. I'd love at some stage maybe to share other stories, but I thought in the interim, if useful, I will send some links to Callum and to Rob and Anne and others, and Rob, sorry, and we, as one side project, I do sort of short documentary vignettes sort of framed around dignity of people making the journey. Just as a side thing from time to time in between crises. So we can send those on just to sort of give a glimpse. And thank you for opening your space to me, for sharing it, and for being here, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to open the floor now for some questions. And, you know, just a reminder to everyone, the chat function is there at the bottom of your screen. You'll see the chat button there. And if you can't see that, maybe on a tablet or a smaller device, you will be able to click more and then chat and pop your questions in. Please do get some of these questions in, and we will put them to Caoimhe this evening. And I want to start with Rab's question tonight, if that's all right. And that's, do you feel that the right-wing rhetoric has become more dominant? And if so, what can we do? How can we counter it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'd be interested to hear others on here's responses as well, because I'm conscious a lot of you are in Britain, and I know that there are very huge challenges there, in the sense of, particularly vis-a-vis the channel, a lot of the response that has been coalescing, as well as a response of solidarity. But it's a hard one in the sense that I almost feel that there's a spectrum. I think there's a spectrum, or a sort of a cohort of people in that spectrum who you know, do not have access, I think, perhaps to the information, to the stories, to the narratives, to the perspectives that might shift, you know, their position into something that is more empathetic. And then I think there's an actually, you know, right-wing discourse. And my experience of sort of working, you know, over the years in advocacy and, you know, doing a lot of public speaking sort of in small communities, I tend to, when I come back from contexts, sometimes speak in cities, but really try and focus on smaller communities, rural communities, places that are a little bit off the beaten track and don't sort of have that access, you know, sometimes, I think, to lots of public talks, but and particularly places in which there has been right-wing organizing to try and counterbalance even a little bit some of that. But my attitude at this stage is I'm not sure if it's worth investing that much time when trying to confront yeah, just sort of the level of racism that exists, you know, within the right. I think there's a lot of very valid and brilliant, you know, programs around trying to de-radicalize, you know, youth that have been swept up into sort of the internet rabbit hole, oftentimes, of right-wing organizing. But at this stage, I almost have made a tacit decision not to, you know, if I publish something and if we sort of get swarmed, you know, oftentimes very misogynistic abuse or very personalized abuse, I don't engage with it, because I don't think there's any potentiality of actually shifting anything. I don't think they come into spaces to learn. It's to attack oftentimes, whether that's sometimes physically, as has been seen in other contexts in Europe, but definitely verbally. So countering it, I think we have to be more vigilant. I find that in Ireland, there is no organized right that has political constituency or electoral sort of constituents here yet. There have been attempts, but it means, in a way, in some ways, it's easier to organize here, because I think we don't face that sort of barrage of, you know, sort of counter stuff when we put out positions out there or try and lobby the government, you know, for relocation of unaccompanied children, or but yeah, I think it's a process. I'd be really interested, perhaps, if people want to input in the chat their thoughts about that as well. But I might also just respond. I think there was a question about the trial of our colleagues in Greece, and the question was, how did that come about? And there was an expression of dismay in the question as well, as to how it could have come about. And unfortunately, they are one of 100 or 24 of 180 people across Europe who are facing criminalized charges for their solidarity work vis-a-vis refugees. Amongst them, up until recently, was a retired nun in Spain, teachers, social workers, nurses who drove people across the border from Denmark, I think, to Sweden at one stage. So in a way, unfortunately, it happened in Poland as well. You know, the offices of various NGOs that were supportive of refugees at the border were raided. So in a way, it has been ratcheting up for the last 3-4 years with the arrests of some of the captains of search and rescue ships, etc. And the way that it's coming about oftentimes is that they are conflating solidarity work with people trafficking. So they are saying that that we collectively as a community, by engaging on the ships or in shore response work, or by trying to resource people on a humanitarian level in refugee camps, they're saying that we are contributing to sort of pull factors, as if the push factors of war and oppression weren't enough to force people to leave. And people are no strangers to the fact that that life is hard for them in Europe. You know, a different kind of hard. But it's the hardness of, you know, parents knowing that no matter how highly qualified they are, oftentimes, you know, they work well below their skill set, probably, you know, for the rest of their working lives. You know, I know a principal of a school from Iraq who was a survivor of kidnapping and torture. She was the principal of a Christian school. She was Catholic, and she is working as a cleaner, you know, in her children's school in France, you know, and she doesn't in any way, you know, degrade or you know, lessen the importance that she, and the pride that she takes in her work, but she talks about the poignancy in a way of, for somebody who's, you know, passionately invested in, you know, she self-researches, you know, all these educational pedagogies and, you know, methodologies, and she's you know, a passionate educator, consummate educator, you know, but she speaks sometimes of, you know, when the school day is done, this is pre-COVID, you know, going from classroom to classroom, you know, with her vacuum cleaner and the mop, and sort of feeling, you know, that proximity and yet that distance, you know, from education. So people are aware that it's hard, but yeah, but the criminalization of search and rescue personnel and responders, solidarity responders, is most definitely getting worse. And as I said, the charges are Kafkaesque, and they will eventually be disproved. I mean, there's, you know, the judiciary really doesn't have a leg to stand on, because some of the charges were leveled at people who were not there when these incidences, you know, are purported to have happened. And, you know, one of the charges is espionage, and that was because search and rescue personnel were listening on open radio stations to Coast Guards that they had worked, you know, in partnership with up until their arrests. But the issue really with the criminalization of that work is that, first of all, it ties people up in these long, you know, legal wrangles that take years, that are highly expensive, that are emotionally depleting, that put people's lives on hold. One of them, an Irish student, Sean Binder, an amazing young man, you know, is training to be a lawyer, and he can't sit the bar. You know, he has these felony charges hanging over him. You know, others have, you know, lost their employment. You know, others have had to, you know, really, in context maybe where there wasn't sympathy, really, you know, had to try and clear their names. So I think oftentimes of the concept of moral injury within all of this work, both vis-a-vis what we can't do, the people that we can't, you know, in a search and rescue context. You know, I know a lot of responders who talk about how they're haunted, you know, sometimes by when there's mass casualty events and, you know, hundreds of people are in the water. And they have to make these split-second decisions. And in those split-second decisions, sometimes people die. You know, I know a responder for whom he was on you know, a dinghy that was responding to a wooden boat that was sinking. And if they got too close, people would panic and it would capsize. So they had to sort of go back and forth slowly to evacuate, first of all, children, you know, pregnant women, and then go back and forth, you know, to try and make sure that they could do the rescue in a way that didn't catalyze panic. But the panic happened anyways, and 2 children ended up in the water. One of them died, and they talk about trying to resuscitate, a toddler. She was 9 months old, not even a toddler, on the shore while his keening, or on the deck of a ship while his keening mother, is in acute distress, trying to get them to save her baby. And there's so many stories like that. And then, you meet these people of such deep integrity, in the work. And they're complex, obviously, we're all complex humans, but, they try so hard to do the right thing by people making this journey. And then they're up on these, really Kafkaesque charges. So in a way, they will have their day in court eventually. It's been 3 years in this particular case of continual adjournments, 3 years of their lives on hold. Could be another 2 or 3 years. They'll eventually have their day in court, and they will prove their innocence. Of that, I don't have any doubt. But it's what message that sends to other people engaging in this work, and the fear that it can instill. That one can end up arrested. And not always, but it's happening with enough frequency that it's definitely a cause for concern.
There's a common theme that I want to take across the next couple of questions, if that's okay.
Yes.
And both of which begin by thanking you incredibly for your witness and for taking the time to be with us tonight. We are really, truly grateful. But they go on to ask a question that I'm sure is in many of our minds who've heard you speak tonight, and it's this simple question, which I'm sure will have a very not so simple response, and that's, what can we do? How can we help? What can we do to engage? What's the most effective thing that we can do to support the people that you're with us tonight advocating for?
Thank you. And in a way, again, I probably don't have the complete answer to that, because I think it's very probably subjective and localized too in terms of response. But I might tie in my answer to that, or my reflections on that, with another sort of question that was, or another observation that was sent, which was sort of how also does one engage, with people who might, who the framing of the question is sort of perhaps through uneducation, or through underprivilege or marginalization themselves, who feel some fears for their survival, with some level of well-being and a sense of threat of arrival at the other. And I think that that's a really valid question, and I definitely didn't mean in any way by my reflection a few, I'd say, paragraphs or pages ago, to seem dismissive of the need, to engage, I think, with some of that othering. But I think that cohort that was referred to in that question, maybe it was sent to me privately by mistake, but I think is definitely worth engaging with, definitely. And I think part of that is shifting a narrative, that instead of, sort of focusing on, you could say, the governmental policies that are failing them, that are the fuel poverty, the cutting of children's, school and lunch dinners, in Britain, the endemic, impoverization of communities, underfunding, the rollback of basic supports, the threat to the NHS, like all of these, systemic issues of bad governance, of short-sighted, governance that oftentimes is based on, the privileged, very disconnected few. But to really try and look at those common sort of oppressors in a way, as opposed to the person sort of one rung down on the ladder of dispossession and underprivilege to you. And I think also, recognizing, the role of racism in that, of that dehumanization, and really, trying to creatively, proactively, do the work, do the education, do the storytelling, do the calling in, the interfaces. So I just wanted to clarify that I think that is valid and important, vital work, definitely, particularly with young people. But just when it gets into that place of like sort of the extreme right, I don't think there's much room really for dialogue or discourse at that stage. So in terms of engagement, depending on where people are, there are a plethora of organizations across Europe at this stage that one can give one's time to. If for instance, people are retired and have stretches of time that they can use, or if not, sort of holiday times. There's ways in which people, can give skills of sort of language exchanges, of cooking hot food. There's a great organization called Refugee Kitchen. Others, across Greece, where you can go and it's the cooking of the hot food, and it's but more than that, it's the friendship forming, and spending time with people who have been, oftentimes their only experience in Europe has been one of negation or diminishment, or sometimes the subtle humiliations of interfacing with authorities who doubt you and your family and your story and your experience. I'd say fundraising is always really important, and particularly during COVID, we've seen a huge contraction in the funds that a lot of very grassroots, self-funded. Oftentimes, people aren't on salaries; they're volunteers. There aren't big overheads by any means, but the work, because of the absence of states, needs, it needs funds, it needs money to be able to, buy the shelters, buy the structures, medical supplies, food, the constant sort of convoys that used to go back and forth to Calais and Dunkirk. I saw a picture on Facebook a couple of days ago, I think by Care for Calais or Donate for Refugees or Refugee Kitchen, or one of those amazing organizations that are really grassroots, but of a distribution from a van of just good rugged hiking shoes and socks, and it's such a basic thing, but when you think of and I've had personal witness to the feet so often of people who make this journey, through working in sort of pop-up clinics on the borders of Serbia and Croatia and Lesbos, further north in Calais. But the concept from the Second World War, sort of trench foot, of just the pain in people's feet from blisters and sores and infected sort of cuts, and then having to wear like wet, oftentimes falling apart shoes, that never dry, when you try and dry them by a fire, and then the rubber cracks, because it's the only place that you can try and dry your feet when it's raining consistently in places like Calais, and then the rubber cracks, and then more water gets into them, and then it's this sort of cycle. So I remember one of those most practical, innovative things that I saw that was started by a young volunteer in Lesbos was when people were still transiting, with speed pre-2016, when people would get off their boats, because we couldn't afford, oftentimes as grassroots groups, to continually buy hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pairs of new shoes, or thousands of pairs of new shoes. People would buy instead thousands of pairs of new socks, and then sandwich bags, so people could take off their wet shoes, put on dry socks, put on a sandwich bag over their dry socks, and put their feet back in their shoes that would keep their new socks dry, which obviously, was only a very temporary solution. But so I'd say fundraising, volunteering, political change, lobbying local politicians in terms of quotas, in terms of the reception facilities when people do get to places of refuge, access to legal supports. There's so many cases in which people are seeking asylum in which they're unfairly ruled against. I know the Home Office, I think 40% of their rulings by their own, sort of audits were deemed, sort of in counter to the basic fundamental rights of refugees. So I think what we're seeing is a negation and an undermining of the Refugee Convention, which came into place, into act after the Second World War, the negation of international maritime law, the negation of international humanitarian law, and it feels like that us as citizens of countries, within the EU and Britain at the moment. I'm sorry, yes, for those of you, yeah, but that. Of just really trying to use what exists in terms of laws, in terms of protections of people for their right to access international protection, and refugee status, that they really have to be held on to and safeguarded. And then finally, I would say welcome. So in small communities and bigger communities, making that time, creating that space, whether that's inviting a newly arrived family over for dinner post-COVID, whether it is, creating the conditions of acts of welcome. I know the Church have been brilliant at that, small sort of church communities in many parts of Ireland, vis-a-vis community sponsorship, which is a great program worth looking into, where communities themselves sponsor refugees, the relocation of refugee families. And just having confidence, in a way that that even though it might seem small in the face of so much suffering, that oftentimes these very simple acts mean so much to people. And before I finish this last long-winded response, I think of Lord Dubs, Alfred Dubs, and I think of other survivors of the Kindertransport, and I remember reading various accounts of them, and there was a consistent sort of almost strength-based narrative around it, right? So it oftentimes did not speak of their trauma or their grief, or it oftentimes spoke about, their fear, their anxiety of saying goodbye, of going, into such a dramatically different context and different families. But I remember, thematically almost seeing, these constant referrals to acts of hospitality along the way. So one survivor of the Kindertransport, or one descendant of the Kindertransport, spoke about how they had been trundling on a train through some country in Europe, maybe Austria, who knows, somewhere, and somebody, a farmer, pressed sort of glass bottles of milk and apples through the windows, to them, and how that was held, in mind and heart, as a sign that things might be okay, that they might be received with welcome. I think of friends who grew up in refugee camps, and they speak about, local community solidarity sometimes, or, the one person who sort of took an interest in them, somebody working in the camp who, brought them a book and could see their potential, and that person goes on to be a writer, and sometimes not. But yeah, I think just really trying to seize any invitation, to create those invitations for our common shared humanity, and to be with people, in their displacement, their exile, and their loneliness sometimes. I know so many asylum seekers, particularly in Britain, particularly young men who come alone. And also women, and yet there seems to be more community around women, and perhaps it's easier sometimes for them to express vulnerability, emotional vulnerability to each other, but yeah, of just deep loneliness. And oftentimes, there was a number of suicides, one after the other, of young men, or deaths by suicide, and and a lot of them were unaccompanied children when they came to Britain, and then they grew out of the system, and I just thought, in a way, sometimes systems, in themselves kill people, in the sense of, they kill their hope, and yeah, so maybe there's a role for trying to rebuild those spaces of hope, yeah, and just love as well.
If I can take Sarah's question next, Caoimhe, she says, how long on average do families stay in the Greek camps before they get their visas?
Good question. Sometimes, always years now. So it's yeah, people are, I know a lot of families on their second, third, fourth refusals, and they keep on going back, because they can't deport them legally. People are being deported through illegal violent pushbacks, but legally for now they can't be deported, and so yeah, people just end up in these states of indefinite limbo. So I'd say an average, of 2 to 4 or 5, but a long time. And that's when, the whole discourse, I think, in Britain at the moment vis-a-vis traffickers, these policies are enabling trafficking. They're creating $1 billion industry, literally $1 billion industry. It's on a par apparently now in some contexts with the arms industry. It's a hugely lucrative business, and it's brutal. Traffickers are, and smugglers to a different extent, but oftentimes, very, very violent, against people. But if people had safe means of passage, they wouldn't exist, near the same scale that they do now. there was also a question, where was it? Something about light and hope and sustainability. What sustains people? Oh, sorry. No,
I was going to take that one next from Anne. I think that's, and I think it summarises. We've all been so struck by your witness tonight. We've all been really, it's such powerful witness, and I think that is a question for all of us in amongst this. Is in the midst of such darkness and despair, I'm sure, what does sustain you, and where do we all find light and hope?
On a personal level, I think it's, within all of the suffering, and I've seen this countless times in different war contexts that I've worked in Syria and Palestine and Iraq and Lebanon, that it's oftentimes in the most painful and oppressive of contexts that the deepest sort of humanity really emerges. And it shouldn't have to be that way. I don't think we should have to face our own mortality to be able to empathize and support others. And there's obviously a lot of brutal things that happen during war too, intercommunity. But there's also a lot of social solidarity. So I take personal inspiration and hope and light from the people, the communities that I work with. I delight in their successes, when they can complete their journeys. I find that when I get little videos on my phone 3, 4, 5 years later of people running towards each other, arms outstretched in some ways cold and forsaken city somewhere in Germany or elsewhere, where in a way, like it's industrialized and life won't be that easy there either. But when families are reunited with each other, and when they're safe, that provides me with a lot of hope. And for all of the heaviness and suffering, people oftentimes maintain the most brilliant senses of quite ironic humor. So there's lots of laughter in the camps. There's lots of community, and in a way, and I think my main challenge actually is not sustainability in the work, just because I find it. There's so much love in it, like so much deep, just powerful love of justice, love of community, love of humanity. But I think on a personal basis, what I actually find challenging is the transitions home. And so having just come back from Lesbos, it's almost like, and I never feel judgment, because I also delight in a way that I can walk down a street and watch children walking to school safety without having to worry about snipers, or watch people being able to celebrate things like Christmas and come together, and in warmth, and and I know it can be a complex holiday for many as well, but in the sense of attachments and families of origin. But I feel in a way, I also have the benefit of, or the luxury in a way, of coming from a family that is extremely supportive of this work. My parents, my siblings, and they're involved in it. They understand it. They empathize with it. But I think the transitions that I find most jarring in a way are when privilege is held, but not maybe not examined, not held with a space of gratitude for all that we have. And this isn't in any way in a such a judgmental way, but more just a way that it's so precious, that what we have, our warm homes, our running water, our freedom from torture, our freedom, to be able to speak oftentimes, without fear of disappearance or imprisonment, our ability to plan futures, with all of the things that the world and life throws at us in terms of pandemics or illness, but generally, be able to have some assurance around some basic things in life. So I suppose when I transition back, I always sort of hold the dissonance of that, that within Europe, within this continent that has known war and fascism, and annihilation, in such a systematic way, that slogan, or those slogans that existed post the Second World War, this history, this continent representing something else, and particularly the whole project of the EU. But it is just very, very sad, to see this happening on our watch. But I would say, just because I know I've spoken about a lot of heavy stuff, but the light and hope, I think for any of you who engage in this, you'll see what I mean, because there's a lot of it. And there's a lot of bravery as well. And that courage is really, both by those making the journey and those responding, so many, young and older volunteers that I meet along the way. It is sort of the stuff of living, it's what makes life for me and this world, still have a lot of beauty.
Thank you. You touched a bit in your own remarks about the role of the RNLI and the pressure that they're under, particularly as that right-wing rhetoric grows. How important do you think it is that we are supporting their work?
Vital, vis-a-vis what they're facing now, both I think in terms of fundraising, there needs to be vital support, but I've been thinking of them, sort of emotionally and psychologically over the past few days, like what they're facing. And I'm reminded of an Italian captain that I know who is now studying international law in Ireland. But he was a captain with the Italian Coast Guard for years. And he talks about how in his small town in Italy, he was celebrated. He was sort of treated with respect and not seen as a hero, but, definitely his work was validated. It was respected. So for years, he was a Coast Guard sort of person. And then when the numbers of people crossing the Mediterranean, began to rise and the deaths of tens of thousands of women, men and children continue to happen, he volunteered as a volunteer captain on an NGO ship. And he was arrested and his work was criminalized. And he went back to the same village in Italy and he was scorned, really scorned, mocked. And, his family received threats at one point. And he lives in Dublin now, but I think of him these days when I think of the RNLI, work that in local communities, would have been seen as something, respectful. I can imagine them being, bought pints at the local pub, because it is life-saving work. And now to be on the receiving end of people who, almost stumbled into this, they didn't go off and volunteer in a camp somewhere in Europe by choice. They're responding to crisis and distress and emergencies, on their watch with a skill set that they're good at. But to now be, subjected to such a high amount of online abuse, I can imagine is really hard. And hard to, for them, to grapple with. I was thinking even the accounts of that were in the media yesterday vis-a-vis, those that died last week and, them calling the British authorities and the British saying to call the French saying to call the British, and it just feels like it's a metaphor for our times, of states sort of ping-ponging people's rights and lives between them. But also, the shame and the guilt, for people who have those skills of not being there, when that dinghy was deflating, not being there to do what they're good at, to do, what motivates and drives them in their work. So definitely, I think they need our backing financially in terms of fundraising, but I also think they really need, in those conversations that we have in our local communities, something that reinstates their work as something honorable, deeply, deeply honorable. Yeah.
The next question I want to take is an intriguing one, comes from Anne, and she says, having seen so much suffering among refugees, what would your advice be to a vulnerable woman, say in Afghanistan, for example, to take their chance and travel, flee, or to stay where they are?
It's an interesting one because I think sometimes there's an assumption that the news doesn't get back home. But these days, in the age of WhatsApp, and smartphones, it does. So in a way, it speaks to the level of persecution and oppression in so many contexts that people still continue to make the journey despite this all. And I think almost that's something, I have seen, cases of, oftentimes I'll Facebook friend, some of the young teenagers that I work with who are unaccompanied, teenagers or children, minors making the journey. And, I'll see them at their most vulnerable, sleeping under bridges in La Chapelle in Paris, in their freezing clothes, the same clothes that they've had on them for months, real food insecurity, oftentimes they're hungry, and so I'll meet these kids in really dire, heavy circumstances. And then we'll Facebook friend each other and I'll see what they put up, and it's them sort of like posing next to like the shiny sports car, that they happen to pass, on their sort of, their daily trek back and forth to receive, a cup of hot soup from one of the local volunteer groups, or and in a way, I think that's the dream of migration throughout the ages. It's not necessarily the flash car, but to do well, to do better, to be able to support family back home. I think coming, by birth from Ireland, I grew up all over the place, which is why my accent is such a mishmash. Canadian childhood, and then different parts of Africa and Latin America. But in a way, I think on our island in Ireland, the millions of people who migrated, a lot of that forced migration vis-a-vis the famine, but then, afterwards, through various different economic depressions, but some of that was by choice, wanting different horizons, wanting something different. A lot of the migration happening these days is not, a lot of it is forced migration, some of it mixed migration, but I think it depends on how we frame what constitutes violence. And I think that, as a lot of us have witnessed in various different contexts, there is a violence to poverty, and there's a violence to depleted resources and livelihoods vis-a-vis climate change, and not being able to access lives of subsistence, for one's family, or subsistence. So I'd say, in a way, part of me thinking about a young woman in Afghanistan would be extremely protective about what she would have to face along the way, trekking through the mountains in Iran, Turkey, the state violence there, the crossing, if they survive it, the sea, the camps, the humiliation, the deportation, the bordered violence in the Balkans, etc. But in a way, I sort of feel that's a life force that can't be stopped. When people flee what they're leaving, but also are grasping towards something different. And I will share a video actually through Caoimhe as well, of an amazing young Afghan musician that I met a few weeks ago in Lesbos called Elena. And she is a girls and human rights and women's rights activist. She's 19, and she's also a musician, and she sings about feeling like a caged bird and her experience of migration as well. But despite that, I mean, even her, who has suffered so much, over the past years in this journey, I can imagine, that she'd do it all over again, because she is going to survive, and she's going to build something with her life, and she's so determined and so capable. So in a way, I think sometimes it's actually easier for younger people making this journey. So if I think of a young woman in Afghanistan, if I think of an older woman, I might reassess that in the sense of like the physical deprivations of the journey and the risks. It's a tough, grueling journey. But yeah, there's an enormous life force, in people who are making this journey, and they're really determined to not just live, not just survive, but to live with dignity, to live with creativity, with some semblance, some glimpse of happiness as well. Yeah.
Liz reflected on one of the things that you shared when you reflected with us earlier. And she said, thank you for being with us, for sharing your testimony. One of the phrases that resonated with me was in the Olive Grove camp, the need for creating spaces of joy and shared hospitality, but also the courage of people to get up every day with the intention to live. I'm sure that's something that struck you incredibly throughout your own experience. And I wonder if you might say something a bit more about that.
Thank you. And sometimes it's good to be reminded of what resonates with people, because sometimes it's easy to sort of normalize when you see it so often. But I was thinking of that vis-a-vis Abu Awad, our dear friend who passed away last night. Last night when I received the news of his death, and the sense of, what did make him, get up every morning and, in that cold, in those oftentimes wet blankets, into another day of breathing in toxic plastic fumes from fires, and the interminable waits. And because his wife Hadija had diabetes, he oftentimes was the one, and the herniated discs, but the one who would line up for the family. And when you line up, and in a way, I've seen this come out in the art already, in writings of people who have lived in the camps. But so much of one's life is defined by waiting, so getting up and sometimes waiting 3-4 hours in a line of thousands of people, to receive a ration that is insufficient, nutritionally for your family, a ration of food that's oftentimes cold by the time that you get up there. Sometimes they run out by the time you reach the head of the line. Standing in a line for hours to try and receive, basic medical care for your granddaughter, who's feverish, sort of shivering, against your chest. You're carrying her as you go along to try and access a doctor who might give you Panadol, who can't give you a prescription for anything stronger than that. Lining up to see a lawyer where you try and prove your case again and again, sometimes without interpreters. Lining up for an appointment with the one camp psychologist for a camp of 23,000 people to try and prove that you have trauma, because maybe, having an official diagnosis of PTSD will help your case slightly. Lining up to receive people's secondhand clothes. And that's one thing actually that I was always struck by, whenever containers of clothes would arrive, secondhand clothes that were donated to camps. Sometimes the beautiful intent behind it, like sometimes we'd receive, shipping containers that had, hand knitted, little booties and hats for babies. And, you could see children who had made individual hygiene packs, like hundreds or thousands of them, with little personalized notes and stickers for other kids. Or there was a lot of like beautiful stuff in those containers. But sometimes you'd get the most, inappropriate or non-functional things, like I remember feather boas in one consignment, and bikinis, and sort of stiletto heels, and then a lot of clothes that have been discarded, from people but that weren't in great condition. And I just thought, it's the one thing oftentimes that people have left in terms of how they present themselves, their identities. And I think it's one thing when you do it by choice, in terms of a rejection of fast fashion, or the consumerist tendencies, certainly in my generation, and probably even more so in some ways the one following me. But yeah, sometimes people don't want people's secondhand clothes. They want something that is new, that is the colors that they like, the material that they like, the cut that they like. And I just remember one little anecdote comes to mind of in 2014, standing on a shore, and then wading into like the icy, frigid waters, sort of up to our chests, to drag in a dinghy, full of people, all from Syria, who had just made the crossing. Some of them were in hypothermic shock, some in acute distress, and amongst them was a group of very hip teenagers from Damascus, like really, just hip teenagers, sort of mod style. And but everybody was soaking wet, because the waves, it had been a really turbulent, sort of choppy night. The waves had come over the dinghy. Everybody was soaked and freezing. I mean, we were freezing, and we could go back to the volunteer house and warm up and sleep in comparative warmth. But so they got off the dinghy, and we took them to this sort of little volunteer-run respite camp that had a big tent that was heated, with sort of electric heaters, and then had just bales of donated secondhand clothes. And normally that process would be very quick one. People would go in, strip off. There was a men and women section, change into warm clothes, and go out and get hot tea, and then see doctors if they needed to, or vice versa, depending on the severity. But these teenagers took a really long time. And I remember, because I was the only sort of person who could interpret, these Greek volunteers who were running the place came over to me, and they were like, we keep on passing clothes into them, and they just pass them back out again. And they're like, don't they understand? There's more people waiting. And, they were getting sort of irate, and they were like, just go translate, tell them to hurry up. And so I went in, and I was trying to like really politely, because like they're teens and they've just survived a lot. And they were lovely, but they were like, sister, they were like, if you could just explain to them, they were like, it's not because we're picky about our clothes. It's because if we wear what they give us, we won't be taken seriously at borders. Border guards will see us, they'll think, who are these clowns? Who are these? And I was just thinking, in a way, what for the Greek volunteers constituted something logical. You take the clothes, they're better than the wet, frigid clothes that you have on, but they're sort of misshapen. They're too big for you. They clash. Maybe there's a pair of Crocs, in there, or a big, over sort of shaped jacket that. But I just felt the fact that these like 16-year-olds, they were already, 20 steps ahead of everybody else. Like they were already thinking about, like, once they hit the Balkans, what is their interaction or engagement or social capital? They could speak English, some of them, but with these border officials going to be these border guards who they had seen, images of days before, beating people, firing tear gas, across barbed wire, at families trying to push their children through, in the hopes of getting them out of, a really intense, response. So I'd say, I think I'm going off on a total tangent, but yeah, just in a way to try and hold within all of this, that, for millions of people on the move, there are millions of stories, millions of subjectivities, millions of experiences. And in a way, I think one of the best forms of solidarity that we can do and inhabit and embody is responding, in as much attuned presence to whatever shows up, whomever shows up, and by whatever whomever, I mean whatever dynamic shows up, whether that is one of distress and overwhelm, or humor, or cynicism, or anger, or grief, just to really try and stay within it, stay with it, in a way that has as much compassion, and empathy as possible for the fact that this journey, every step of it is hard and disempowering oftentimes.
I find that so powerful. I find that so powerful, but also haunting to think of young people having to forward plan and think in that way. And I think, I always find it fascinating when, particularly as a secondary school teacher myself, when you always get the inevitable voice from the back of the classroom who thinks they know it, and they say, but they've got phones with them. Yeah. And I always reply by saying to a class of, particularly senior pupils, and I go, right, imagine for a second a disaster hits us here. What's the first thing you're going to grab? Let's see, even the fire alarm goes off just now. What's the first thing you're all going to grab? Yeah. And I think it's so eye-opening to think of young people having to forward plan their lives in that way, right down to what they're going to wear. I think if I could maybe squeeze in just one final question for you, if that's all right, because I've immensely enjoyed our conversation tonight, thank you. But it comes from Joyce Mary here, who reflects on what you've said tonight. She says, your experience among the suffering refugees in the camps has really touched my heart. And my memories, she says, of my time watching Kurdish refugees, whose kindness and generosity towards me as I've grown older is overwhelming. It's wonderful to experience the way their life has become better in their life here. The poor really can teach us about kindness and gratitude. I'm sure you've experienced this. And maybe it's the teacher in me myself, but this idea of learning from others, yeah. I wonder if you might say something about that from your own experience.
Without a doubt, and thank you, because I think that's such a deeply important point that you're both bringing into the space, and definitely, I mean, daily, monthly, weekly, yearly, and I think that's been one of the most powerful things, to witness, because in a way, I feel when I came into this particular iteration of refugee solidarity work about 8 years ago, I'd had a couple of decades pre that of that learning, of working with refugee communities, sort of from when I was 16, 17, in other contexts. So I think I understood, that complete reciprocity, and oftentimes, very unequal relationship, in the sense of that I was being taught so much, in terms of values, in terms of tenacity, courage, resilience, humanity, compassion, ingenuity, oftentimes. But I think it is always really important, to understand that the life experience that people carry, is there's so much wisdom in it, so much to learn from and with. And I think, vis-a-vis whatever is organized, and I'm thinking here vis-a-vis your students, and how important it is. And we really try and facilitate this. Sometimes I work in education myself, but with young people sort of interfaces with people on the journey. Some of those young Afghan women that or teenagers that I met recently in Lesbos were connecting with classes of learners here. But the preparatory work that we do with the students is always around sort of strength-based narratives of not framing, these young women in their vulnerability, but in their strength and their courage, in their potential. And also commonalities, that there's so much more commonalities, that instinct to grab the phone, definitely amongst a certain age cohort, but also that the phone, the phone is safety, the phone is GPS, the phone is WhatsApp, the phone is, communication when you're in crisis, communication when your ship is sinking, or when your child has hypothermia in a forest somewhere. The phone is, in a way, it's people's lifeline these days, in terms of some safety. But in terms of that learning, I think in a way that is one of the most powerful forms of solidarity that was expressed, vis-a-vis, in that case, Kurdish refugees, but of, people have their experiences oftentimes in Europe up until they get to a context where they can actually sort of put down some very tentative, exploratory, hesitant, routes, or not even roots, it's a long process, but is one of negation and diminishment, and sometimes rejection if they pass through contexts where there's overt racism. And to be valued as sort of experts by experience, I think is so powerful. And I've seen that oftentimes, when inviting young people in to address other young people, teenagers, or, older asylum seekers, teachers speaking to teachers, medics to medics, artists to artists, workers to workers. So showing that commonality, of profession or of skill set or of interest, but for them to be framed in something other than, tragedy or, suffering is really important, because there's so much more than that, that is a few years in a life lived, and hopefully a long life lived, but yeah, I personally feel deeply that, in a way, without fetishizing or romanticizing, because I don't do that. And I felt similarly when I worked with Indigenous communities in Latin America. But I feel in these times that both the center of sort of suffering, even though people suffer in lots of different ways, and I'm very conscious of that, vis-a-vis marginalization and poverty, in Britain, in many parts of Europe as well. But I really feel like the center of suffering and the center of a very deep humanity are sort of co-present amongst those seeking refuge these days. And there's a real impetus and invitation to respond, I think, to that, to both the suffering and to the light, to the joy in that.
Well,
yeah. But I wish I could hear you all, and I think I've got a little glimpse of just the wisdom and the nuance, and yeah, just the reflections in this space. So thank you all very much as well. And I wish I could.
And I know
all 90 something of you, 76 of you.
I know I speak for everyone, and we were joined by almost 100 people tonight, and I know that probably partly because I have went on a wee bit and overran. I can see the looks coming in, of course, but I have really enjoyed our conversation. Your witness has been incredible, and I can see from the chat the thanks and the messages coming in that is shared across the platform. We were asked if there was a recording available, and Rab will be sharing that out by email, as always, very, very swiftly, so over the next day or so. And I'm sure if there are any links that you want to be circulated with that, I know you've suggested a few things, Rab will include them in that email to everyone, so please keep an eye out for that. But with that in mind,
stay in contact. Also pass over my contact details if anybody wants to engage in any way. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand back over to Anne.
Well, Caoimhe, we've been inspired this evening. We really have. Your amazing breadth of experience has really been outstanding, and You know, we'd all like to join to say thank you. I'm going to ask on our behalf, really, Kathy and Jerry McCabe to say a few words of thanks to you. But, you know, really, really outstanding.
Caoimhe, many thanks for being our companion in this part of the Advent journey. It's been quite amazing tonight. I can only echo what's already been reflected in the chat. You know, your ministry, your witness, your courage. It's really, you know, quite astounding, and I'm left with so many things, you know, bouncing around in my head, you know, after tonight that I will take away and think through, and just, you know, some of the vignettes and some of the details that you've offered, you know, that you know that just, you know, allows us just to think through, you know, some of these many challenges that you know, that are so much part of our world today. So once again, you know, many thanks, and yeah, we would like to now offer a prayer for your continued witness. Loving God, we thank you for the gift, insight, and witness of Caoimhe. We thank you for what she has shared with us tonight. We ask that you anoint her anew with your Spirit, such that your fire may continue to burn within her. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for that gift.
To everybody, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we look forward to being with you next Thursday on the 9th of December for our Mary of the Magnificat companion, Jessie Rogers. So thanks to all of you and good evening.